If you're new to Destiny 2 and haven't seen my previous video, the Destiny 2 3-minute breakdown, I'll have a link to that at the top of the video. In this video, we'll be taking a look at one of the aspects of Destiny 2 that's hardest to follow for new lights. This is demystifying gear and stats. In Destiny 2, you have 6 primary stats. I'll classify these into 2 categories, passive stats and active stats. The first category, which I'll call passive stats, consists of mobility, which increases movement speed and improves jump height. For hunters specifically, it also reduces the cooldown of the class ability dodge. Resilience, which increases damage resistance in PvE and shield capacity in PvP. For titans specifically, it also reduces the cooldown of their class ability barricade. And rounding it all off, recovery, which decreases the time between taking damage and starting to regenerate health. For warlocks specifically, it also reduces the cooldown of their class ability Rift. Next, we have the second category, which I'm calling active stats, which are as follows. Discipline, which reduces the cooldown of your grenade ability. Intellect, which reduces the cooldown of your super ability. And strength, which reduces the cooldown of your melee ability.
Hey, 99% of you aren't subscribed, and if you want to be blessed by the Traveler's Way, I suggest you do. I'll give you 3 seconds.
Every 10 points of a stat gives you 1 tier in the corresponding stat, up to a maximum of 10. This means, to max a stat, it requires 100 of that stat across all gear and mods. Each stat tier increases the effectiveness of the corresponding stats effect. If you want a little more in-depth information about how these stats affect your character, I'll go ahead and put the charts up on the screen right now. There are 2 types of gear in the endgame of Destiny 2, legendary and exotic. While some other rarity items exist when leveling up, they aren't useful in the late game. Each piece of gear has inherent stats on it, excluding class items, which have 0. On legendary gear, the minimum a single stat can roll is 2, and the maximum a single stat can roll is 30. The minimum stat total on a single piece of gear is 46, while the maximum stat total you can have on a legendary piece of gear is 68. Now, remember how I broke stats into 2 categories, passive and active? Each category on a legendary piece of gear can have a stat total of 34 without modifiers. This was the most perfect example I could find, but it is missing 1 stat pool. Exotic gear can roll a stat total of 71. The highest single stat roll I was able to find was a 32. There is an extra point left in resilience, which means it could potentially roll a 33. So wait, is all gear random? Am I at the mercy of Xur and RNGesus to obtain gear with stats I want? No. If you go inside of your ghost, you have something called an armor ghost mod. This will make gear obtained from random drops have a base of 10 in the desired stat, as well as ensure that a stat in the opposite category, passive or active, will also be a base of 10. As an example, if I have the Discipline, Armor, or Ghost mod selected, then Mobility, Resilience, or Recovery will be chosen at random to also have a base stat of 10. This would also work in the opposite direction. If I had the Mobility, Armor, or Ghost mod selected, then Discipline, Intellect, or Strength would be chosen at random to also have a base stat of 10. This is where things get a little bit better. Each year of Destiny 2 is broken down into 4 seasons. Each content season gives you the ability to focus pieces of armor at a seasonal event table. This will guarantee a base of 20 in the selected Armor or Ghost mod stat, as well as following the rules of having 10 in a random opposing category stat. Exotics work slightly differently. They essentially have an Armor or Ghost mod built into themselves, guaranteeing certain stats inherently. I'll list a Google spreadsheet below that lists them all off and how they prioritize stats. But essentially, if you're trying to target focus a certain exotic, you want to select an Armor or Ghost mod that isn't inherently built into the priorities of the piece you're farming. Each piece of gear can also be masterworked. This increases the amount of energy available for mods, and at level 10, increases each stat by +2, giving you +12 in each gear slot. As you increase the masterwork level of your gear, you're going to require resources from harder and harder content in the game. This ranges from glimmer and legendary shards, which are readily available from dismantling gear and doing relatively easy content, to enhancement prisms and ascendant shards, which are obtained from the hardest forms of content. The maximum base stat rolls prior to masterworking will bring your stat total to 275. Once everything is masterworked, it will bring your total stats to 335. From here, we can increase our stat total even further by getting into general armor mods, armor piece specific mods, and combat style mods, which we'll get into in part 2 of this video. That's the basics of stats and an introduction to the basics of build crafting. Honestly, we've just scratched the surface. I hope you found this video informative, whether you're a veteran player or a new light. In part 2, we'll dive into how to use stats to synergize with gear attunement, different types of mod slots, and how to make a build. We'll also round it out with some of the most useful tools you can find to organize all your builds, quick swap your gear, and organize your inventory. And if you could, please hit that subscribe button and the bell notification next to it. It really helps out. Until next time, Guardians.